Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are joining us. We are starting slowly, while others may be joining. We're really happy to have with us today Peter Cole from Western Illinois University in the US, discussing the very interesting case of hiring holes in San Francisco. Peter, thanks very much for making time for this workshop with some of the course participants that are studying, particularly those that are studying for a specific certificate. Please put your questions either in the chat box or take the floor later on. In either case, please keep the questions short to allow time for more questions and focus on the insights from the video lecture. So Peter, let us start where you actually ended the video lecture, which is really interesting, as it really looks at this very prominent trade union strategy of hiring holes in the midst of widespread precarious casual work. So what are some of the key insights from this case study that you think are important for the activists, labor activists and trade unionists that are actually trying to organize today workers in more or less similar conditions?
Thank you very much for the question, and good day wherever you happen to be. It's a pleasure to be talking with you folks. And I think the work that Global Labor University does, including in this course, is wonderful. So thanks to Peter for inviting me originally, and Edlira, and Ale, also for all the help. So I happen to be in the area where I studied and wrote about for you, which is actually unusual. I live several thousands of kilometers away from the San Francisco Bay Area normally, but I happen to be here. And just 2 days ago, I was in the hiring hall that I wrote about for this course. Well, for me at least, that's sort of an incredible coincidence. It's actually quite uncommon. I am speaking to you from Northern California, and I'm not in San Francisco. I'm in what's called the East Bay, which is Oakland is actually where the port is now, although historically it was in San Francisco. And San Francisco was from the 1840s into the 1970s, the most important port in the United States. And in the 19th century, the United States was not the most important economy in the world, far from it. But by the early 20th century, actually, the United States industrially was the largest economy in the world, right? And San Francisco was therefore the largest city right on the West Coast, which is on the Pacific Ocean, and therefore literally the U.S. gateway to the Pacific world, including what became the U.S. Pacific Empire, right? And so traditionally in San Francisco, in the state of California, the work was hiring was done in the way that it was done in cities and port cities around the United States, but also in port cities around the world, right? Which was done on a so-called casual basis, meaning that temporary, you were hired for a specific job or a small period of time with that job, with no guarantee of work beyond that specific job, right? And in the United States, that process was nicknamed the shape up. And so you might say you are shaping up. And you might have heard, but it's an old slang in the US, like you can shape up or ship out, right? That Gifford and I were talking a little about yesterday. You could either work on the waterfront or you might get on a ship, right? Ship out, as in you get a job on a ship, right? And so the effects in the United States, in San Francisco, but in other ports too, like in ports worldwide, right, was that dock workers suffered from dangerous work conditions, long hours, and low pay, right? And the reason why the sort of work conditions were so poor and the wages so low, right, is in no small part because of that hiring process. And in no small part, it was somewhat obvious, right? There were large surpluses of workers, right? Because there was a lot of poor people in the United States, and a lot of unemployed people in the United States. And in addition to that, there were always newcomers arriving in big cities, right? In San Francisco, if you live in the West, you move to or you want to sort of find a better job opportunities, you might move to the biggest city, right? Or the most vibrant city, right? And so newcomers from the United States might arrive in the cities, but also immigrants, newcomers to the United States. Where do they arrive? They literally, at that time, everyone traveled by ship, right? And so you would arrive in a port city, right? And so there's these large labor surpluses, right? That's not unique to San Francisco or even American port cities, but that was the conditions, right? And I should even note that this is that this union and this that sort of emerged to sort of end the shape up emerged during the 1930s, which is the so-called Great Depression, which means there's even higher rates of unemployment, right? Much higher rates of unemployment, right? And traditionally, logically, but even today, you might think that these are the sorts of conditions that are will never result in worker power, right? Because employers can essentially weaken and divide workers by playing them off of each other, right? That was the whole reason that the shape up arguably existed in the first place. Employers were able to get plenty of workers whenever they wanted, right? And they could get not hire workers whenever they didn't want, right? Because you weren't on permanent salary, right? You were instead hired by the job, right? Of course, everyone understood, including workers naturally, that this system was hard on them, right? They understood that dividing themselves and forcing to compete against each other resulted in not only weak workers, but lower wages, more dangerous conditions, longer hours, and very hard to sort of change that. It was in 1934, 5 years approximately into the Great Depression, right, that a so-called big strike emerged among dock workers in San Francisco, who also were coordinating with dock workers in other ports on the Pacific coast, right? In Los Angeles, actually that time a small port, and then all the way north in the United States to Seattle, Washington. Right. And in this big strike, they were able to shut down the shipping industry for much of the summer of 1934 for many, many weeks. Right. And that crippled the economy in 1934 across the Pacific coast. And as a result, employers eventually or actually repeatedly used repression. The government generally sided the local government with the workers, excuse me, with the employers. And after weeks of strike, the San Francisco police tried to sort of break the strike, resulting in the killing of two strikers in an event nicknamed Bloody Thursday, which is still an important event in the local memory of San Francisco Bay Area dock workers and the entire union. It's actually now a legal holiday, right? And so they negotiated later for a contract, and later, actually, one of the holidays they get is this event called Bloody Thursday, which actually is commemorated at all the local longshore unions up and down the coast on July 5th every year, right? And ultimately, the federal government intervened. At that time, the federal government was actually sympathetic to workers, much more so than previous administrations, and that president was Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR. And he was a Democratic Party. This is also interesting because the Democratic Party is actually transitioning from being not very pro-worker to becoming the party among the two leading parties that was much more pro-worker, including but not only pro-union, right? And we could talk about that. And then the union, as it came to be known, the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, although it wasn't officially named yet, won a bunch of gains. They won union recognition. They won reduction in hours. They won significant raises for hourly work, as well as sort of raises for overtime work, right? Where before in this industry, like many others, often you might work 24, 36-hour shifts, right, with short breaks, right? And so now you would be paid actually not after 8 hours, but actually in the 30s and for a while after 6 hours. Because they were trying to shrink the number of the union, and other unions were trying to shrink the number of hours worked in order to spread the work, right? And most importantly, for the purposes here, right, the union also won what they call a hiring hall, in which the union dispatches, which is to say, sends workers out to different jobs, right? This hiring hall, according to the contract, was hypothetically jointly managed by the union and employers, but really the union controlled the process. The union members were elected by their own members, right, by the rank and file, to be the job of dispatcher. They would elect each year, say six, depending on the size of the local, right, a handful of dispatchers. So among their own, they selected some to serve as dispatchers. These elections that originally were annual, right? So frequent elections in order to be able to replace work dispatchers who you don't like, aren't doing a good job, or for that matter, don't want the job, right? And so these union members who are dispatchers means that the workers themselves control who picks who goes to work. That way, workers aren't divided in these ways. There was no discrimination, at least in principle, among those who were dispatched. And so the workforce was diverse in various ways, although later it would even become more diverse. So the dispatchers would dispatch regardless of ethnicity, race, nationality, if you're a union member, right? And a sacred principle in the LWU was that you also were dispatched on what was called a low man out. At this time, the workforce is all male, right? Low man out. And basically that meant, say in that quarter of the year, if you show up at that union hall for work, say tomorrow morning, right? Depending on how many hours of work you had and in relation to the other workers who show up that day to get a job, those who had the least amount of hours worked would get the preferential treatment. They would be dispatched first, right? And so those who had earned less money would get the first jobs, right? And this is wasn't not everyone works the same amount of hours. Not everyone shows up for work every day, right? But among those who did show up, those who had earned the least would get the first jobs, right? And that was a form of economic equalization that was highly unusual, right? To say the least. And it also equalized among the members, right? And it showed that the workers themselves were committed to not only me personally making enough money to survive and thrive, but also that we would earn enough money. That's the whole principle of sharing the work. Instead of whoever shows up first gets the job, we equalize the work as much as possible among the members, right? The hiring hall, in some ways, might be seen of as the most important victory in the big strike of 1934, right? By contrast, the union that still represented dock workers on the Atlantic coast of the United States and the Gulf Coast of the United States did not eliminate the shape up. And did not dispatch and does not dispatch in this sort of way, right? And because it's unusual in that the United States actually has two unions, right, in the same industry. And that is because the West Coast dock workers had broken away in the 1930s to form this more democratic, anti-racist, egalitarian, but also overtly more left-wing union compared to their Atlantic coast counterparts. So the hiring hall sought to eliminate discrimination and promote equalization of the work. It's sort of obvious that it's in principle, at least, relevant to workers today, right? At least I hope so. And I look forward to talking with you all more with the questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. Thanks a lot for those initial insights that I hope everybody also had a chance to watch the video lecture also before. Any questions or comments, and please do keep those short and related to the video lecture. Anybody would like to go first? We have one question in the chat box, Peter, from oh, okay, so there are two actually. Brian, why don't you do the question yourself? And I'm going to read Isis' question also right after Brian's. Brian, go ahead.
Thank you, Peter, for your presentation. So, my question is the hiring hall. So we have seen that how it has developed has become a leverage for the longshore workers. So I'm just wondering if that situation is unique for longshoremen, or can other sectors or even other places, for example, the longshoremen on the East Coast, so can they adopt a similar strategy? So, thank you.
Thank you for your question. So I think I know a lot about labor history, but your question is a very big question. So I don't know. I don't have a great answer. I have hopefully a decent answer. So in the United States, at least, and I'm trained in as well as lived in and from the United States. To my knowledge, there were not other unions, I mean, that had hiring halls of this sort, right? In that way, if unique actually means one of a kind, the word sometimes is misused. It doesn't just mean unusual, right? It actually means one of a kind. It actually might be unique, right? Which is even more somewhat shocking, right? If something is unique. So like in the most American workers, like in most countries, I think, most workers aren't union, first of all, right? Like, and so most workers simply don't have a hiring hall that's worker controlled, right? Among those union workers, right? Generally, most industries, you work at the same location for the same employer every day. That's actually logic. It's not illogical. It's not logical, I suppose, but it's actually the norm, right? And so if I work in the steel industry, I work for, say, a company, U.S. Steel, right? And I go to the one factory and I do my job, right? Like in ports, ships come in and out. There's often different companies that control the port. They're not state controlled either, right? Although there's some state oversight of the geography and the space, right? So there are actually dozens of employers, right? And each day or week, you might dispatch to a different part of the port, to a different dock or a different pier, working different cargo and the ships are actually owned by a different set of companies than the docks, right? And so the industry is not that industry is not unique, right? There are actually other industries where this sort of layout exists, but from the worker perspective, you don't have the same boss every week or maybe even every day. You actually, and so arguably in that way, workers don't become loyal to a company because many workers in many industries, whatever you might earn and do, you might develop an affinity or affection for your boss or your company, or you feel at least a sort of an identity. Whereas in this industry, which is, I would say, normal and casual work, right? There is no loyalty to a single employer because you don't actually work for a single employer, right? Which is in some ways, like I said, to the benefit of the union, right? Because many workers often do develop this sort of loyalty to an employer who may or may not be a good employer, right? And so um, there are some other industries in the US where you do, in fact, have different employers. I'm thinking of the building trades, right, which is a common industry around the world where, say, you're a carpenter, right, and you might work on a building site for a while, not just for a couple days. And then you have another employer after you finish that job, right, although that job might last weeks or maybe months, right? And in some of these other unions, you would be dispatched through the union, right? And then you'd work for a single employer for a contract, right? But that contract isn't just maybe a few days, right? But to my knowledge, those sorts of hiring halls, those unions were not committed to equalization of work, right? At all, right? And weren't in the U.S. as in many other countries. Prejudice is a common theme. Racism, sexism, xenophobia, and so those realities percolate through and sort of were part of many workers' identities, sadly, right? And so the carpenters might not let in the Chinese. The carpenters might not let in Black people, et cetera, right? And so they operated differently because they were not committed. They didn't have the same ideals as a organization, as an institution, as a union, right? Whereas the LW was founded by people who were committed to not just earning more money and working fewer hours, although those are good things to work for. But also they had a broader political agenda, right? And many unions sometimes are just what's called business unions, right? Their only reason for existence is wages and hours, right? As opposed to wages and hours and maybe a larger or other agenda, right? So outside of the United States, I've never heard of a union that organized its hiring halls in these ways, but it's quite possible. Simply, I just am unaware because I'm still learning about America, and I've been working for 30 years on American history. Right? I'd love to know, and so if you or others know, right, of other places where this sort of institution existed, please do tell me today or later. But I'm actually suspect that it's, if not unique, incredibly rare. So I apologize for the long answer, but thank you. It's a really good question, and there's, as usual, not a short answer.
Thank you very much, Peter. And Peter Rosman put sorry, there is a bit of echo. And Peter Rothman put an example, not exactly the same, but an example of that idea in the chat box. And it's one of the video lectures on the widows in Italy, North Italy, women widows in North Italy. There was a question from our comrade from Peru about how did this hiring halls became also a space of activism for the union? And then adding to that, Peter, what I found really fascinating that it wasn't just about a principle of equality, but it was so much more important to build solidarity within the working class. We know that precarity puts workers even more, makes people think even more inwardly and kind of think just for themselves. But here you have some sort of an intervention that tries to kind of overcome that insecurity that comes from precarity and building solidarity in between the different groups of workers. So if you can just respond to that, and then I'll take the other questions, also including Jacanoya, and then there was another one.
Of course. Thank you, Isis, for the question. That is an incredibly important, the hiring hall was not just a place where you got work. It was also much more than that, right? And so I'll say it in two ways. First of all, it's a place where you can see your friends, right? Like people you know, right? And so if as opposed to online where we do what it's a sort of a convenient tool, but it's not the same as being in the same room with someone, let alone the same country. I appreciate that we're a global, sort of meeting, and that's awesome, right? But how do we really build bonds, right? Oh, I saw you in a Zoom meeting, right? Well, I don't remember all of you because you're just a little face on a box, right? But if you go to the hiring hall, of course, you don't just immediately show up in 1 minute and get your job and then you're gone in 5 minutes. You might actually show up early. I've actually witnessed this, right? I'm sure others have too, where some people choose to show up earlier because they know they're going to see other people, including some people who they like. We all can't like everybody. They're but we see our brothers, right? Because unions often use brother and sister as a comradely phrase, right? And so you show up early, right? And then, well, maybe you don't always get a job, right? Maybe there's not a lot of work in the hall. You also stay after, right? And so although they will dispatch, there often might be 2 or 3 dispatches in a day, including a night shift, right? 2 often, right? So day and night work, right? People would stick around, right? Oh, I don't get a job. What am I going to do that day? Well, the stereotype is you go across the street to the saloon, right, and get a drink or 2, and that actually might be happening next, right? Or you might just say, we sit around. Union halls often are also spaces where people learn from each other. So traditionally, before we all had these things, right, the union actually subscribed to newspapers. The union subscribed to magazines, right? The union often in the United States, and I assume in other countries, might have a bar itself, right? And so you might hang out and just enjoy the union hall with your fellow worker, right? And we could talk more about that, and that's interesting. But the other way is sort of more to the point of your question, right? Is that the union was sort of arguably the most important part of the hiring hall was the most important part. In the words of Local 10 leader, the San Francisco Bay Area branch, Herb Mills, who recently wrote a novel that I helped to get published, although he passed away a few years ago. The hiring hall was indeed the union. It was the institution whereby the reality of community could be fashioned and maintained by men who had agreed to structure and divide their work on a fair and equal basis, and who, through great strife and conflict, had won the right to do so. And so within this union, there's this culture of people who were part of that original big strike, who are nicknamed 34 men, because the strike occurred in 1934, right? And for decades, right, people would identify as, oh, I'm a 34 man, right? And they were known as such, right, because they had created the union as well as these ideals, right? And they were people who very much wanted the union to not just be about earning better wages, also more than that. they really wanted, a number of these people were radicals and revolutionaries, right? Like who saw this as not the end game, but actually part of a longer, larger struggle for societal and maybe global change, right? But it also could be the place where other workers come, right? And so, like we were talking last night, actually, about how, say, another group of workers went on strike. And if you're on strike, you're not making any money. How do you actually survive a strike if you don't have any wages? This union would actually let non-union members show up for extra work at their hall in order to help workers on strike in other workplaces and other industries that they might be able to survive their strike, right? Like because they had some income, right? Like although it's not uncommon for workers on strike to find other jobs during a strike in another field, right? If possible. But the union, this union, would often let sort of people they give priority. Okay, we want to give these people some work, some money, right? Like that's an incredible form of solidarity, right? But it also was where they talked about how they could build more than that. And so, as Peter and some of you may know, I've done a lot of work on this specific union, which sometimes refused to work ships to load or unload cargo because of either the ship's country of origin, right, or the cargo. Right. So, for example, in the late 1930s, just a few years after the hiring hall was created, Japan invaded China in the Asian Pacific theater of World War II, right? Actually began before the European War, right? Like, and where in the United States, even though Chinese Americans were reviled, were hated by a great many white Americans. The Chinese community of San Francisco was famously the largest, where the Chinatown neighborhood was the largest, and Chinese people would protested against the U.S. support for Japan. At that time, the U.S. had normal trade relations with Japan, and the U.S. was or I should say, U.S. manufacturing parts and cargo were being shipped to Japan, which of course helps the Japanese imperial war machine, right? And these Chinese San Franciscans set up picket lines, community, not worker pickets, and collaborating or coordinating with the union, right? The dock workers refused to cross these picket lines, essentially refused to work these ships because the cargo of these ships were going to go to Japan in order to, essentially strengthen Japan, which meant hurting China, right? And so and even though Chinese were reviled, and I should say most Japanese Americans were also not liked by their fellow Americans. They actually couldn't be citizens if you were born in these two countries. Your children could become citizens, but legally, immigrants from Asia could not be citizens. That was just a racist, prejudiced laws that existed at that time in the United States. But nevertheless, at that time, the ILWU was 98% white, right? Like 98% European and European American in solidarity, which also means when they don't work, the dock workers, they're not getting paid, right? Like, which means that not only are you supporting some other country's freedom, you're willing to take an economic sacrifice, at least for a day or two, which is an incredible form of solidarity too, right? Not just being sympathetic and going to a protest, but taking money out of your pocket that could support you and your family. And so and this is not unique, of course, to San Francisco dock workers. There's actually long histories of dock workers and sailors and other around the world occasionally doing this sort of thing. You might know, including about last week, right, where dockers in Piraeus, right, the port of Athens, who refused to load weapons for a war in Israel, that's the most obvious contemporary sort of resonance. But there's a history of that across the 20th century. I don't know if it preceded the 20th century, but there's actually, in the 20th century, there's a number of examples in a number of countries for a number of reasons where you're basically refusing to work in sympathy with people in another part of the world who you probably don't know and never will know. And that's solidarity, right? If you are willing to make a sacrifice on behalf of humans who you've never met and never will meet, who are different than you, but of course you're all humans and workers, right? That's bold, right? In this union, that also is another example. The equalization of the work is an example of solidarity among, but so too these sorts of work stoppages, which, the ILW has a long history of this sort of activism, and a lot of my research has also been about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Dokonia, do you want to take the floor? You've been raising your hand for a long time. It's good that it's just virtual. You have been very tired by now. So do you want to go first? And then Wisdom, we go right to you.
Okay, thank you, Etira. Thank you, Peter, for the excellent presentation. In Zimbabwe, we have a system that is more similar to the hiring wars, but this system is now being run by a government department and they call it employment exchange. I would like to check from the history who was responsible with the running and administration of this hiring wars. Because in Zimbabwe, I think it also goes across sectors, but in this instance, as you can see, it was only for one specific sector or industry. But now, based on the notion that unions also survive on subscription, would it not also favor those who would earn more so that the union will also get more subscriptions? How was the modalities of financing this setup? Thank you.
That's a great question. And actually, first, let me say I've never been to Zimbabwe, but I hear it's a beautiful country. I have spent a great deal of time in South Africa. And the book that I wrote that deals with San Francisco Dockworkers also deals with Durban, South Africa. And I want to come back to that, right? So in the United States, the United States is very much a decentralized economy. In that the government, the federal government, let alone the state or the local government, simply are not involved in those sorts of things. The United States is very much a capitalist or so-called market economy, right? And the notion that the government would control hiring halls has, whether it is attractive or not, simply has not been, right? Very much not historically. Even in the 1930s, where there's these massive unemployment, and you might think the government might try to rationalize work in some sort of way that was sort of, I guess you might think of it as socialistic. I do appreciate that, since independence, Zimbabwe has actually been state sort of more controlled than, in the United States, right? So how, therefore, since it wasn't state controlled and isn't state controlled, so according to the union, the contract between the union and employers, because, as I mentioned to Brian's question, right, like you don't have a single employer, there's not a group of workers who have a single employer. In the United States, basically employer associations were created for this industry by the companies themselves, not by the state, right? And so they represent all the employers in bargaining with the union. Otherwise, these companies are sometimes competitors. But of course, as I mentioned, there's different parts of the industry. So you have shipping companies, you have those who control the docks, who might do labor contracting. There's other sort of components of this industry. So you have multiple different companies who operate in different sections, you might say, of the industry in the port. And of course, some companies work in this port, but not in that port, right? And so today, what's called the Pacific Maritime Association, the ILWU has a contract with the PMA. And the PMA might include Maersk, might include Costco, might include various different companies, right? But there's a single labor agreement. And so too, you might have paid attention to the US that there was recently an important strike on the East and Gulf Coast with the other union in the industry in the United States, the International Longshore Men's Association, where it's the same thing. It's a different employer association, but it's the same concept, right? Basically, that the workers, through their union, have a single relationship with all the employers who themselves organize themselves. How they organize themselves, honestly, I do not know. I imagine there's some sort of dues they pay, right, in order to fund the various different things they need in order to sort of manage and maintain, because the PMA in the San Francisco does have an office, and they do coordinate with, all the different member companies on their side, right? And I mentioned earlier that the union controls the hiring hall, but hypothetically, it's actually jointly run, and the employers do exert some power in who gets to join the union. So when, to be dispatched, you have to be in the union. How do you get in the union? Well, every now and then, could be years, years, where, say, LA Long Beach, Local 13, needs more workers for whatever reason, more work, retirements, people move. The PMA and the LW actually jointly manage the process of who gets to be in the union now, not historically. And now that's done electronically, right? And so, for example, LA being the largest port on the West Coast now, right? If there might be, the union might say, we have 500, we want to take in 500 people who work as a casual, and then later, possibly, but not definitely, enter the union on a more permanent basis because they have sort of tiers within the union now, in sort of not everyone's equal members from the first day, right? That 30,000 people might apply for 500 jobs or 500 members, huge demand because people appreciate actually that being in this union is a ticket to probably much better financial fortunes and maybe some other things too, right? So that's a little on how this particular industry and this particular coast and port operate. It's not state controlled. It's actually really union controlled, but with by contract, by that the Employers Association also plays some role in this process. If I can come back now to Jokanaya's talking about Durban and Zimbabwe, right? Zimbabwe is a landlocked country, right? It does not have ports. Depends upon countries that are along the coast in order to receive and ship in and ship out, right? At least according to the current boundaries established by the British, right? And so in Zimbabwe, as you probably well know, like stuff sent out to Maputo in Mozambique, although it used to be Lorenzo Marques until 1974, the Portuguese controlled it, right? Or Durban, right? And so Durban is a key, as you know, like connection point for the economy of Zimbabwe, right? Since Durban is geographically the closest port in South Africa, which is a much bigger economy and better infrastructure than Mozambique, right? So Durban is very important and connected to Zimbabwe. Now, historically, as in the 1980s, as you probably know well, when Zimbabwe finally became free of white minority rule in southern Rhodesia, right, like that many Black South Africans found a home in Zimbabwe, and the anti-apartheid movement, including but not only the African National Congress, operated sort of openly in the 1980s in Zimbabwe, just across the border from South Africa, right? And so that the early sort of years of the Zimbabwean nation, right, was very much allied with and supportive of, in a material way, the anti-apartheid struggle across the border just to the south in South Africa, right? And that was very well known and appreciated, right, by those in the struggle, as many people call the anti-apartheid movement, which of course had domestic, was in South Africa, but also in the 1970s and 80s became global, right? In the 1970s and 80s, in the port of San Francisco, circling back to the question of solidarity that Lira talked about, dock workers in the San Francisco Bay Area formed a committee within their union called the Southern, not South, but Southern Africa Liberation Support Committee, right? Because at that time, in the mid 70s, Mozambique was only recently free in Angola, but really they were in the midst of civil wars funded by the United States, but also the South African apartheid regime to destabilize these new Black nations, right? Zimbabwe was not free at that time, right? It was still Rhodesia in the 1970s, right? Namibia was still controlled by South Africa, Southwest Africa, and Namibia would not be free until 1991, right? And so Southern Africa, as you no doubt know better than me, right, was the last part of Africa to become decolonized, right? And dock workers in San Francisco Bay Area, who by the 1970s were majority African American, so there were still a lot of white people, but over time, this union's demographics within the Bay Area had changed dramatically. Formed a committee and said, we are going to engage in solidarity activism with the people of South Africa and Mozambique and Namibia, right, and Zimbabwe. And they sent material support, right? So they sent food and clothes to Dar es Salaam, which at that time Tanzania was actually the leading country in East Africa, giving support to these freedom struggles to the south, led by Julius Nyerere, and occasionally refused to unload cargo from South Africa in the port of San Francisco, right? Most famously in 1984, where for 11 days, dock workers refused to work a ship. And that was the single most impressive action in the United States of workers as workers, expressing support for what was going on in South Africa, which by the 80s was sort of exploding, you might say, right? Fast forward to our century, the 21st century, right? Durban dock workers, Durban still being the most important port in South Africa, but also to connect to the Zimbabwean economy. In 2008, as you may know, probably very, very well, and I don't know your politics, right? There was an election cycle going on, and the opposition to Mugabe was, of course, the labor movement, right? The movement for democratic change, right? And the labor movement was seen as a threat by Mugabe, right? And the Mugabe regime used police and the military and other means in order to basically suppress the opposition violently. In that time, Durban dock workers refused to unload a ship full of weapons from China aboard a Chinese ship in Durban. And that ship didn't unload its military cargo. That ship later was refused to be unloaded both in Maputo and Luanda on the Atlantic side of Southern Africa. And I interviewed some of those leaders in Durban in 2010, just 2 years later. And I said, so why'd you do this? I might have some idea about that, but they're like, the Zimbabweans supported us in the 1980s, right? And we want to support them as the workers, right? These guns are going to go to kill workers, right? These bullets will kill workers, right? And so we are not going to be complicit, right, in unloading these weapons. Now, as you know better than me, that did not result in Mugabe losing power. He, in fact, remained in power until his death, the better part of 10 years later. But it was an incredible example, and it's not the first or the last time that Durban dockers have engaged in that sort of activism, right? And so although you might think of this as the Bay Area, and so one chapter of my book actually deals with these issues of transnational solidarity activism, because it's an incredible example, and it's another way, separate from casual work, right, that this union can operate, going back to Ed Lear's point, if it has a politics beyond simply improving the members' wages and material conditions. Right?
Wow, very fascinating. Thanks so much, Peter, for sharing that wisdom. Comrade, you've been waiting patiently. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Adria, and thanks very much, Peter, for your explanation. Mine was similar to my colleague in Zimbabwe. By the way, I'm Wisdom. I'm coming from United Mine Workers Union of Zambia here in Zambia. I was confused when Peter just introduced this topic where he was saying hiring war. And in his explanation, he talked about the union having had that mandate of hiring labor on behalf of the employers. So I was like, well, how does that happen? Because, it's the employer who employs, and then to come up with a union is amongst the workers who come up with a recognition agreement, which is signed by both parties, and then the union is recognized. But then in his explanation to my colleague in Zimbabwe, I've understood, what it means and what he's trying to actually, say. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you. I'm friendly with a guy named Duncan Money, who you might know, Wisdom. He is from England, but he's a historian like myself of labor, and his research has been of especially Zambian and other copper miners, and I think he lives in Zambia now. But Duncan Money is his name, and you might try to find him if you don't already. So it's an important question. So first, the book that I wrote, out of which the subject we're talking about today comes from, is called Dock Worker Power. I mention that because if you're asking how do workers get these sort of deals, it's only because workers have some power, right? If workers are not well organized, first and foremost, you can't achieve these sort of successes, right? Like individual workers will never do this, right? So I shouldn't have to tell this, it's sort of obvious, right? But it's because these workers were well organized in a union, right? That they were able to command gains, right? Like now, so much power, right, at that time, right, they shut down basically the industry, right? So why do employers make concessions? It's because they have no choice, right? Like strikes were, and I still believe are the most powerful weapon that workers have because it forces employers to the table who otherwise may not want to or hate unions because they have no alternative, right? Like they want to restart the work because that's how they make money, right? Like and so how do you pressure employers separate from the state, right? Because I know sometimes we have state-owned enterprises or the state's more involved, right? But separate, keep leaving the state out for a minute, right? Like if workers are strong enough, and this is, of course, in any industry, in any part of the world, they can command, I don't know, higher wages, safer workplaces, because not because employers are nice, some of them are and some of them are not, right? It's because they don't have an alternative, right? And so when workers are strong enough, and you don't always need to be in a union to be a strong, coordinated effort, although it's logical that you would be. Strikes and unions are two separate ways that workers collectively can exert power, right? They often go together, but historically in the United States, and I would bet in most countries, strikes weren't necessarily of union workers because unions might have been hard to create or in some places illegal, right? Like or simply not legal, right? And in the United States, it wasn't until 1935, right? Really the 30s, 33, 35, that workers had the right. There were still strikes before 1933. It's just that workers didn't have the legal right to be in unions, right? They weren't banned, but they weren't required. Employers didn't have a legal obligation to negotiate, right, with a union. Often strikes would include a demand for union recognition because they wanted to not have to fight this fight every time. They want to go, look, this is our representative, talk with them on our behalf. Because employers don't want to do that. They want to have individual conversations with the individual employees because individuals are weaker, right? If you're called into the manager's office and you're saying, I'd like a raise, that's not going to work. But if 1,000 of you say, we'd like a raise, right, that's more likely. It's not a guarantee, right? Like, so it's also important to note that in this industry, as I mentioned earlier, you do have multiple employers, right? And workers don't work for a single employer all the time. And that is significant. That's not unique to this industry or this place. But of course, in many industries, in many places, you do have a single boss forever, or as long as you're in that line of work, right? Like, and so not every sort of historical example, of course, can apply to every other historical example or contemporary example, right? But there are obviously a number of other industries, especially in casual labor workforces, where you don't have the same boss, right? I'm thinking of agriculture, right? Where often you have these short-term contracts, say at harvest, right? And then you have some other employer, right? Maybe even during the same season, maybe even during the same harvest cycle, right? Because after you say pick, I don't know, the apples in this orchard, then you get hired to work the apples in another orchard, right? Or to harvest the maize, right? Like and so. I say that because you might think, is this sort of so unusual that it doesn't apply to my sort of industry or my country? And the answer is it might not, right? But it's not, this industry is not unique, right? Like casual labor, as you all know, and I appreciate in this course, the way it's organized, is in fact a common form, right, of labor around the world, past and present, right? And therefore, there might be relevance, historical examples might be relevant to your situation, right? But it might not be, right? Like, because I don't know, mines are sort of fixed places, capital intensive, a single employer, although I do know that many mines often you have multiple companies that own different mines, right? And so there might be some relevance, but maybe not. It's not a perfect parallel. There never is really sort of perfect parallels, right? Where they're identical situations. But the short answer, after my long answer, comes back to what I said. The damn name of my book is power, right? These workers had the power to negotiate these sorts of gains, right? Because they had already organized, right? And then were able to force employers to accept concessions, major concessions relative to many other workers in the US in many other industries, right? And so these workers, not immediately, but became nicknamed. Sometimes they called themselves the Lords of the Docks, right? And that previously they were sometimes nicknamed wharf rats, right? They used to be crap, weak, poor, right? They became much wealthier, where they had self-respect, but they also were respected by others in the community. And every worker knew, not every worker, but many workers knew, these guys in this union actually are incredible and they get paid more. And that's what, of course, most people also want, right? Like, and I say today, just go to the parking lots of a union in the ILWU and you'll see a lot of fancy cars, right? Because for blue collar workers in the US, among the highest paid blue collar workers, labor workers are in this industry, in this union, right? Like, and that's why 30,000 people put in to try to join this union when there was simply a few hundred possible openings, right? Like, because it's like a good gig if you can get it. Because of containerization and technological change, there's actually far fewer workers in the last 50 years in this industry than there were pre-container, right? Because you need far fewer people to load and unload cargo because of these massive technological changes that have occurred that are global, that actually began in the United States and also impacted South Africa in some significant ways. And South Africa was actually the biggest economy in sub-Saharan Africa and Africa actually up till recent times. I hope that was interesting and helpful wisdom.
Yeah, thank you very much, really. We have a few minutes left, so Mithu, why don't you go make your question quickly, and then we give Peter a chance to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Sister Edlia. I will take only 1 or 2 minutes. Yeah, thank you very much, Peter, for your nice presentation. And I have listened to all about comments, speeches and comments, and I'm learning a lot of things from this. But it's not a question, but it's a comments you can treat as. Then the hiring hall is a new concept to me, basically. But which I have learned from your video lecture that it's one kind of database that whether the employer can take some initiatives where they will put some specific information step by step, like job request, required skill, job location, and the duration of working condition, matching of the workers related to the other things. And some of the workers, they will follow the some guideline and they will apply or submit to work accordingly. But I am just wondering a question from you that, like Bangladesh, still we have not any database that how many workers are working in Bangladesh as a informal workers or formal workers or casual workers. We have no any database as a national or centrally. So how we can and how we can use this term towards Bangladesh for our workers that will be much appreciated to the workers as a union member or they have get some good job as per the requirement. So I am looking forward for your suggestion or comments in this regard. Thank you.
I confess I had a hard time hearing you. The technology is failing briefly. If I understood your question, tell me if I'm wrong, right? Like, so what's the parallel to Bangladesh? There's not a hiring hall system that you're familiar with in your country. Let me say that this is organizing workers. You all are in, the labor movement. It's hard, right? Like, but that would be in order to get a hiring hall, right? It wasn't the way it was done, right? Before this union emerged in this city, in this region, employees, potential workers, right, would go all across the waterfront. There would be multiple different piers or docks where workers would have to show up to shape up different times of the day with no guarantee that they get a job. So you might have to go many kilometers to a workplace with the possibility, and there might be hundreds of other people who do that, and then you don't get picked, right? Like, and then you have to like scramble and maybe go to another part of the waterfront because depending on the place, it might actually be geographically very large, right? And hope that you might find work. Although that you might only have one time. If it's 8 a.m. that everyone shows up at all these different piers, if you show up at this pier, you can't show up at that one. And if you don't get work, you don't get work, right? Like, so the system was chaotic. And that was also to the benefit of the employers, right? Because workers were weaker, right? And so workers figured this out. This is not rocket science, right? And so many workers in many places have figured out this, right? And going, how do we get rid of this, right? Because the system hurts us, right? Like it weakens us, right? We make less money. We're played off each other, right? I don't like those ethnic groups, and they seem to get all the jobs, right? Like sort of stuff. And so the union fought, right, like for this. And so once again, it does come down to workers being organized, and that's where people like yourself come into the picture, right? Like I presume, because you have to convince workers what actually they might already know, right, or have figured out, or at least understand if it's explained to them, that it would be in their best interest, right, to sort of collectively bargain. This is easy to say and hard to do, right? Like as you probably know much better than me, right? But that's it does come down to this hiring hall was a creative approach to this casual labor system. And although the union is maybe one of a kind, casual labor is actually super common, right? And so like hopefully that's of relevance in Bangladesh to you and others. But the hiring hall, that same idea could be instituted in other industries in other countries, right? Like if workers are strong enough, but also might have sympathetic state, because the state does matter, obviously. And seeing that you have a new government now that might be more friendly to workers, or at least less unfriendly, right? That bodes well, right? Because I mean, and of course, it can be workers who help elect or select state power, right? Presidents, prime ministers, whatever, parliament, right? And so it's not the only front that you fight on, right? Workplace, yes, but also I would suggest the political arena, the formal electoral political arena, is a vital source of struggle, right? So that you get more favorable laws, less hostile government, maybe less hostile police and army, right? Like those sorts of things, right? Because I mentioned at the beginning, the workers suffered from police repression, right? Like Bloody Thursday, and they remember this, right? Like they actually reinforce it annually, right? And that is actually wise, right? Like because people might forget or not have known it because they were not alive when this was originally occurred. Hopefully that was helpful. Thank you, Mithu.
Thanks very much, Peter. Very, very interesting conversation. Perhaps also as a way of wrapping up, one question that has been accompanying us through these workshops. This is actually the final workshop for this chapter on why organize has been the question of intersectionality. And one way in which I think this labor history course is so important is because it's telling us the story of how workers' movement and trade unions have been organizing, in this case that you were discussing, overcoming ethnicity, race, and religion differences, as you put it. So that's a practical expression of intersectionality in the struggle that has happened well before the term was coined. So perhaps also your final thoughts on that, on the importance of these spaces for solidarity and activism that are able to also overcome the divisions that the employers were using to their own benefit.
Well, you said it very well, and so I could just say I agree. But I'll also say, the union that I've been talking about today, and I was again just 2 days ago in their hall here in San Francisco. I was in a room with some other people talking about, well, the history of their union, and on the wall of this room is their motto or their slogan, and that slogan is a famous one: "An injury to one is an injury to all." Solidarity is basically a one-word version of that, right? But an injury to one is an injury to all is actually, way better because it's a little more clear what the hell we're talking about, right? That motto originally came from the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, although in the United States they had changed an earlier motto from a 19th century union called the Knights of Labor that was an injury to one is a concern of all, right? And it became an injury to one is an injury to all. Another way to say that is none of us are free until we're all free, right? There's a lot of different ways you could say it, right? But that's the sort of the most basic reason that unions matter, right? Because we all have to be involved is essentially what that slogan is saying. And that slogan was moved to other countries. And so in South Africa, many unions today, including but not only in COSATU, the big trade federation, is an injury to one is an injury to all, right? And so that motto actually entered Southern Africa in the World War I era by way of sailors from the IWW who brought it to Cape Town, and then it spread through a union called the Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, which was the first great black union in Southern, not South Africa, in Botswana, in Zimbabwe, in Rhodesia, and other places. Hundreds of thousands of workers were part of the ICU, ICSEE. You might say ICU, right? But ICU with a C, the letter C, right? Spread this motto across the region, right? And then subsequently, other unions picked up this slogan, which is why today, if you look at the COSATU banner, you'll see on its sort of symbol, an injury to one is an injury to all. But that comes from the US, right? And the LW did not create that slogan. It actually also took that slogan for itself from an earlier union, although it still exists, right? And that's solidarity, right? An injury to one is an injury to all. If you hurt, I hurt, right? If you're bleeding, I'm bleeding. If you're doing better, I'm doing better, right? And of course, this is a value system that many countries have and many cultures have. Ubuntu in Southern Africa, right? Ubuntu is the same sort of thing, right? It is not me, it is we, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Peter, for very, very interesting discussion. Thanks, everyone, for questions, comments in the chat box. I see there are lots of comments too. This has been really, really interesting week with many interesting discussions. We are wrapping up the workshops for this chapter. And next week, we start with workshops for the democracy chapter.